Hello everyone, Republic Jim here. Just wanted to do a quick discussion about a topic that's been on my mind a lot lately, which I titled Preparedness versus Proficiency. And what I'm talking about here is the preparedness that a lot of people think of, which is just kind of stockpiling lots of things, having an emergency kit or whatever, versus actually knowing how to use those items and being physically capable of making the best use of them. I've written about that a little in the past. I had an article on LinkedIn, which if I can come up with the link for that article, I'll put in the description down below. I also shared that article on Facebook back before I deleted my Facebook account, but I wanted to just get it on video, kind of discussing the same idea for those who haven't seen any of the posts in writing, and just expand on the idea a bit. First off, anybody that frequents any groups or forums or anything for prepping or disaster preparedness type things, I'm sure they've all seen posts from the guys talking about what they have in their bug out bag, and some of them have everything but the kitchen sink, and it's great that they have all these items in their bug out bag, but I kind of question how many of those items they actually are familiar with using, and if they would be able to make any sort of efficient use of those things in an actual emergency. And then the real thing that blows my mind on that is that frequently the guys that have all of that stuff in the bag have never actually even tried to put the pack on and walk a few miles with it. And anyone that's familiar with backpacking or just grabbing a pack out of the rig to hike out if you get stranded or something, if you're familiar with that, you know that there's a big difference between just picking up a bag full of stuff in your house and actually putting it on your back and walking with it, especially in steep terrain and that sort of thing. So I mean, the physical fitness is a big part of that. If you're really overweight, it's not going to make a lot of difference that you have a well-stocked bug-out bag if you're not capable of carrying it very far without having a heart attack, or at least being so winded you can't keep going. So, I mean, that's the first consideration there, is just that physical fitness. But then, like I said, you can have all those items, and that's great. I highly encourage people to have good emergency gear, but it all comes down to actually being able to use it, because the best emergency gear in the world isn't going to help somebody that's clueless about putting it to use. And while some of it has instructions, you really don't want to be figuring out how to use it when you desperately need it. You want to be able to just grab the items you need and put them to use right then, and with good skill. So that involves actually learning how to use the things, practicing under conditions where you're not in an emergency. Not necessarily ideal conditions, though. I highly recommend learning those things under lousy conditions, but in a controlled environment, so that you're not frantically trying to figure it out on the fly when you need it. For instance, I know some people that have never started a fire in their life, but they'll still put fire starting gear in their emergency equipment, and I really question whether they would be able to get a fire going if they actually had to. And then there are those who have practiced starting fires, or who start a fire frequently in their fireplace or their wood stove at home. So they're a step up on the people that have never started a fire at all. At least they know the basics and they have some practice with that. But to be realistic, if you're looking at emergency scenarios, when you're most likely to need a fire is it's going to be when it's extremely cold or when it's wet or both. And again, anybody that actually has experience with that can tell you that starting a fire under those conditions, especially in the dark also, is quite a bit more difficult than starting a fire in a nice warm dry house with bone dry kindling and everything else. Going out, finding the material that you need and getting that fire going, and then sustaining it and building it up, you know, out in the cold and the wet and everything, that's a whole different game than at home. So what I recommend and what I practice on that myself is going out in the snow or after prolonged rainy periods and building fires, starting it with different methods, whether that's a ferro rod or a Bic lighter or whatever, and different types of kindling, and just experimenting with those things and practicing to where I'm comfortable with being able to start a fire under pretty much any conditions. And that's where the competency really comes in, as opposed to just being prepared. You know, if you're proficient in starting a fire, then even with substandard materials, you're going to be successful. But if you have really good fire kit but don't know what you're doing, you're likely just to end up with a smoldering mess anyway and not be able to get a fire going when you need it. So work on that proficiency on that. And then, like, one example I gave in my article is the recommendations that you see for emergency kits. AAA does it, ready.gov, they all have information about building kits and for evacuating the house or for carrying in the car. And again, I'm not putting that down at all. That's great. I highly recommend it. In fact, I recommend more than what they do, just because I do feel that it's really beneficial to have a broad selection of good quality gear just in case you need it. But like, for instance, the winter car kits that they talk about, there's so many items on those lists that if you just load it in your car and think that you're prepared, you're going to be really disappointed if you actually have to try to use them and don't have any proficiency in it. Just basic things like jumper cables. You know, it used to be everybody knew how to use those, but nowadays so many of the newer cars, it's hard to even locate the battery. A lot of people never do have any experience with jumper cables. So do you know where and how to hook those up and make use of them? And as far as other items on the list, road flares. Lots of people have never lit one of those. Do they really want to be out there in the dark on some abandoned highway trying to figure out how to, you know, read the instructions on it, trying to figure out how to light that flare? That's something that's good to practice beforehand, know how to do it, be proficient in it. And then just simple things like the recommendation of carrying kitty litter for traction. That all comes down to knowing what to do with it, which sounds really like a no-brainer, especially for anybody that is familiar with it. But I have really been surprised to see people trying to get traction dumping kitty litter behind their tires when they're trying to go forward, or in front of their tires when they're trying to go backwards or whatever, or dumping it in front of the tires that don't have any power to them. You know, if you have a front-wheel drive car, it's not going to do a lot of good to throw kitty litter in front of the rear tires. And yet I've seen that. Same thing with putting on chains. I've seen somebody stuck in snow trying desperately to get out, spinning their front tires while the chains were on the back tires. That's a complete failure of proficiency, and it could have easily been solved by practicing learning those things ahead of time before they needed it. Then there's a shovel, which is another one of those items I wholeheartedly agree everybody should carry in their vehicle in the winter. If you get stuck in the snow or mud or whatever, a shovel can really save you a lot of grief if you're able to dig yourself out. But again, something as simple as that, you'd think that it's pretty basic, but you're not prepared just by having that shovel. First off, there's the physical fitness part again. If you're not fit enough to do some serious digging, then it's either going to take forever or the shovel is going to be completely useless, especially if you're like bogged in enough that you're high-centered. And there's also the matter, again, of knowing where to use it. You know, I've seen an example where somebody was stuck in the snow, high-centered on it, and they neatly shoveled out around all the tires so they could get traction, right? Makes perfect sense, except that the whole underside of the car was high-centered on the snow, so the tires were just spinning and they were going nowhere. You know, how many people have had experience with actually digging out snow under the center of the car? That's something that takes a fair amount of physical fitness and the know-how to understand where you have to dig to get it freed up. It's not something that people just automatically understand and are able to do. So something else to practice on. Frankly, I recommend deliberately getting a car stuck in snow or mud or something and then practice getting it out. And then you know that you're proficient with that skill. And this is something where I'm not just talking, you know, pointing my finger at people saying, you know, you're clueless. I mean, this is something that I have to consciously think about frequently too. For instance, the other day I was going through my search and rescue pack and updating some of the items and reorganizing, and it occurred to me that I carry a tourniquet, but I've never actually practiced with that. I know the basic concept, but I need to actually get that thing out and practice putting a tourniquet on, tightening it down, you know, doing it all correctly when I'm not completely stressed out, because without that practice and actually getting the muscle memory doing that under a stressful condition, you know, do I really want to be trying to muddle through it when I'm ducking arterial spray? That's basically, you know, that's not the best time to be just kind of guessing that you're doing it right. It's good to have that practice ahead of time. So I will be working on that. And then there's other things like sharpening knives and saws and that sort of thing that I need a lot more practice at, because, you know, if you're carrying the gear, sharpening stone or file or whatever with you, and you're able to do that out in the field, you're theoretically prepared. But if you're unable to use that to actually get sharp edges, then it really is an exercise in futility, and you're just carrying extra weight that's not doing you any good at that point. So I'll be practicing more with that, so that if it becomes necessary, I can sharpen my knife and saw in the field, and then at that point I will be much more proficient and prepared, realistically prepared, not just theoretically because I have that gear in my pack. So, and there's just any number of examples I could come up with, but that's kind of the basic idea. I'm not going to go on and on just beating a dead horse, but my recommendation is, if you're figuring that you're getting prepared or you are prepared or whatever, go through the gear that you have, take stock of that realistically, look at it and assess whether you know how to use it all well or not. And if you don't, then plan on taking some time to practice and become proficient with that, do it under less than ideal conditions, but not emergency conditions. One other thing I should mention that I highly recommend is most of the lists that I see online for these emergency kits mention a flashlight. Well, that's great if you're going to be doing things at night where you only need to have one hand free. But for those of us that have done a lot of stuff outdoors at night, I can tell you a headlamp is the way to go. And if you practice any at all working on your proficiency, you'll come to that conclusion quick enough too. Just the benefits of being able to have light wherever you turn your head and have both hands free. I mean, that is just huge when it comes to trying to do all these other tasks during an emergency situation. So keep that in mind. You know, get out there, practice those skills, become proficient, keep looking at other things that you can do to expand your skill set, because obviously the greater range of skills that you're proficient in, the more prepared you are for any kind of scenario. No matter what emergency comes up, you'll have confidence that you can realistically face it, not just because you're supposedly prepared by having tons of gear in your bag. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share on that topic. This has been Republic Jim. I'll talk to you later.